and welcome to the Europas Awards. My name is Mike Butcher. I'm the founder of the Europas, and we are going to discuss what is next for mobility. The very loose theme this year is a year on post-COVID, the COVID recovery, and of course, perhaps more importantly, living with COVID. COVID-19 shut down or slowed cities for a brief time as smog lifted and traffic disappeared, and we got a glimpse of a cleaner, quieter, less polluted world. Of course, cities can't stay locked down forever, but post-COVID, how can we ensure we move towards most sustainable, less polluted cities, and how can mobility and, of course, mobility startups help reshape transportation in cities? To discuss this subject, we've got some fantastic panellists. We've got Fred Jones, who's the VP and Regional General Manager for TIER Northern Europe. James Brooke, who's the Chief Product Officer for Free Now. Christian Bauer, the Chief Commercial Officer for Volocopter. And I just want to point out that we made extensive efforts to secure a female panellist, but unfortunately they weren't able to join. But we will absolutely make amends in future panels. Now, let's get on the same page to understand where mobility is as a sector right now. Maybe, Fred, if I could turn to you first. TIER has scaled across Europe. It's very well known for its mobility solutions, such as its e-scooters. You're General Manager for Northern Europe. What sort of things are you seeing?
Well, obviously, COVID has changed how people move around cities. So, we have seen that really change both last year as we entered into lockdown and now as we're seeing people come out of it. For example, people use our service, our scooters, for much longer trips than traditionally the case. But also, COVID has really been the making of micromobility, and we've seen a huge acceleration and adoption of our service in cities right across Europe. And that's not just from consumers who want to travel in the fresh air, in a socially distanced way, in a fun way, but also by cities who have really seen the benefits of reducing car travel in the city, realise the importance to solve the climate challenge of shifting people into more sustainable modes of transport. And so, to give you an example, the e-scooter trials that we're now operating in the UK and launched in London last week, they wouldn't have happened without COVID. COVID was really the impetus that brought e-scooters up on the government and local authorities' agenda.
Right, yeah. We all realise that local authorities scrambled to try and get people moving again in cities without putting them onto crowded public transport where COVID would have been a real problem. James Brooke at Free Now. Obviously, you have a range of solutions. Obviously, you do also do taxis, of course. What sort of things did you see during the COVID pandemic and just after as countries unlocked?
Yeah, I think exactly as you said, Mike. Obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, there was pretty much a full stop when it came to mobility, especially in the centre of cities. I think we definitely saw a shift over the last 18 months during the pandemic to actually much more movement happening in the suburbs, which I think you would obviously expect because obviously people aren't traveling into the cities, they're not going into the offices, they're not going shopping. So there's a lot more movement happening outside. I think also, like you said, we've gone through a process at Free Now in the last 18 months of integrating lots of different mobility options onto the platform. So not just the licensed taxis and the private hire, but now also, partnering with TIER and launching scooters and e-mopeds, also private car sharing. And that's actually a space where we saw an increase because I think obviously there became quite a strong sensitivity towards health and safety from customers as well. So I think choices were being made to actually travel in modes of transport where you weren't surrounded by other people. So if you could take your own car and actually replace that taxi journey with a car, I think there was a preference to do that, especially during the pandemic. That's starting to shift now. And I think, London is quite interesting because obviously as a European city, that's coming out of lockdown earlier than many others. And we're actually seeing that there's a shift now towards black cabs. So we're seeing record increases in black cab usage, which I think probably has a couple of reasons. One, again, is that safety, right? Very much in mind, because obviously you have the screens between you and the driver in a black cab. But I think also there's a lot of pressure on the supply base when it comes to PHV, because a lot of the drivers haven't fully come back to work yet. And obviously that leads to surge pricing, so increase in prices and ETAs. But obviously, you know, we can offer also the black cabs, and we're seeing that there's a big spike in that kind of demand as well.
Right, yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see if that's going to sort of tail off, or do you think it will stay at the levels that it is, or do you think it'll go up?
I think it actually is probably going to go up, especially through the course of this year. I think it's difficult to tell what's going to happen next year. I think definitely for this year, I would expect to see that happening, and it's the same in other European cities as well, right? So I think there is, at the moment, or at least from we see from our platform, that there is a slight preference and increase into the license taxis. But I would expect that as the drivers come back to work, and obviously as the vaccine rollouts and the lockdowns start to ease, then I think probably we're going to start to see a bit more of a balance between those. But also, like Fred said, you know, with the summer coming now, obviously the different mobility options like e-scooters and e-mopeds are also extremely popular, especially, you know, when you think about, you know, the choices that people are making about how they're going to get to the office now that they're opening again. It's not so much on public transport. It's definitely more on the newer mobility options.
Right, I see. So it's really interesting how it's changing across cities. Christian, obviously Volocopter hasn't really launched yet, but obviously it's part of this new generation of transportation, these kind of almost autonomous or semi-autonomous drones, human carrying drone-like helicopters, but versions of helicopters. Your Volocopter, of course, is drone-like. It's yet to launch. But I'd be interested to know from you, did you see more incoming from cities looking more at air travel and short air travel as potential solutions in the future?
Yes, indeed. So actually, what we call air taxis, so flying then fully electric people, you know, from, for example, from an airport to the city center or in the urban environment. What we have seen is, of course, that business travel has stopped, right? And I would say that when Corona gets better or COVID gets better, that then there will be an appetite to immediately go on travel again for business traveler, tourists, and so on. So I think this is something we are seeing already now on the consumer market. Secondly, I think, of course, the travel industry or aviation industry has taken, the legacy industry has taken a big hit. But they had already also the time to think about sustainable concepts, think about, you know, electrification. And this has really accelerated the whole, what we call urban air mobility trend. Yeah, and you've seen that the last 6 months, a lot of investments went into players like Volocopter. In Volocopter, we also closed our Series D round, and also the confidence that this will come in technology was accelerated a bit in that phase. So we really see a positive nuance for us when now the market is coming back, that also the thinking about smart cities, sustainable cities, is coming to a next level, and that helps also Volocopter accelerate their plans.
I see. So it's obviously cities are looking at these other new kinds of solutions to get them moving again. Another issue that's obviously come up in the last few months, and also looking forward into the future, is the idea of the environment, and everyone has become incredibly aware of how much better the environment was in cities when people switched to, you know, walking, electric, anything that they could get a hold of. I'd be interested to know, Fred, did you notice that you've got more, like, greater satisfaction from e-scooter use? Are people sort of noticing the difference in that sense, that climate sense?
I think so. I mean, one of the byproducts of COVID is everyone's realised just how a little bit more livable their city is without, you know, mass private car use, traffic, pollution, noise. So I think from the consumer point of view, you're absolutely seeing that, and just liking the fact that light electric mobility just helps you access a greater range of your city and your neighbourhood. We're also seeing it from city authorities too. You know, there's been a big trend in tenders, you know, Paris, London, where Tier was both successful, how we ran our business and proving that we do so in a sustainable way was a core criteria that the cities were looking for. And our leadership in that area was instrumental in our success. So everything from renewable energy in the warehouse to fully zero emission fleet vehicles and cargo bikes, all the way through to how we manage our hardware and kind of circular life principles, recycling both the hardware and the batteries as well. So we're seeing the elevation of the sustainability on the minds of consumers and cities, factoring into our business in a number of different ways.
Yeah, and I suppose, James, I presume you would concur. I mean, I often characterise this, what's happened in the last year, as being the switch from the sort of the propeller-driven fighter in World War II to the jet engine in the latter part of that period, and it's just such a transformation. Are you seeing more demand for electric vehicles across your business?
Yeah. So it's actually quite interesting because we've introduced now options for customers to specifically choose an eco option when it comes to taxis and PHV. And we're actually seeing that there is a very strong demand for that from customers, and especially young customers, actually, who potentially maybe are a bit more conscious of the environmental issues. And that's something that we see a lot through Central Europe. And I think obviously also, there is a very strong sense at Free Now that we really want to try and reduce private car ownership, right? So I think obviously we can offer the ecological options on the platform, but at the same time, we really want to try and give the option to the public to actually get rid of that private car so that we can actually start to free up more space in city and urban environments and potentially reclaim that for maybe more bike lanes, maybe even more park space, more pedestrianised areas. And that's something that we're very committed to try and support for the next couple of years.
James, actually, as a follow-up to that question, I know that Free Now did heat maps of Lisbon. In those heat maps, did you notice people moving out of cities? What sort of data did you get from that?
Not so much moving out of cities, but definitely moving within their home environment, right? So I think obviously people were based in the suburbs pre-pandemic and then were moving inside the suburbs, right? So what we saw, and I think maybe the heat maps will actually get shown, is that obviously in the center of the cities, we saw that there really wasn't much movement happening there, and everything really started to move to the outskirts and to the suburbs as people were actually moving on the outside as opposed to going into the actual city centres.
That's very interesting, isn't it? Fascinating data. Christian, I'm going to assume, obviously, because your vehicles are electric, that there's a very, very big environmental component to them. But what sort of vehicles do you see your Volocopter replacing? Do you see it replacing sort of polluting helicopters or short haul air jets, or what? How do you position it?
Yeah, I think we see the Volocopter air taxi service as an addition to the city. We do not want, to get rid of the train. It doesn't make sense. It moves thousands of people, or public transportation. There will be always a taxi market, right, and so on, and ride-hailing market. There will be scooters, bicycles. We will add a new service for, let's call it distances that are normally heavy congestion. You're in a traffic jam, you're flying over a river where there's a bridge, and you always have a problem, or cross-border. So we are really looking for use cases where on the road, you will not get there in time predictable, right? And this is what we are offering. And in the beginning, maybe with a smaller scale, and then when production ramps up, also really, you can think about when you go skiing, like a gondola. So every couple of minutes, Volocity will start and land, right? And it will be like a network then of different routes in a city. That's what we're envisaging. And as you know, I think by 2050, 68% of people will live in the urban area, and the people are moving. So there will be more congestion and the ground will be overpopulated. So you cannot add more roads. It's very cost effective, but doing an air bridge will be easy to implement, also from a cost perspective. And, with this new technology being so safe, being also silent, because when we talk about sustainability, it's not only being electric, but also noise. Yes, I would say in the future, you will only see electric helicopters because the cities will not allow, high noise vehicles flying into the city. And today, we are also certified to the highest safety. We will be 100 times more safe than a classical helicopter because we have 18 motors. And if one or two fail, it doesn't matter. We can still safely fly. So it adds safety, it adds to the overall sustainability, but we are an addition clearly. And then later on you will choose, do I take the train, do I do a flight with the Volocity, and then I take, for the last mile an e-scooter. This will be then the best case seamless transportation way we are looking at.
Well, thank you for mentioning e-scooters. That gives me an excuse to ask Fred about that, because I'd be interested to know if you have any data as cities started to get moving again. Did you notice anything different to the way e-scooters were used pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, or was it really just a boom in use?
We saw an uplift across the board, but I think there were the data showed two interesting changes. The first is pre-pandemic, it was peak times were morning and evening with the commute. What we've seen now is actually the peak is in the middle of the day, maybe from 10 a.m. onwards, as people are a bit slower to leave their houses and carry out their errands during the middle of the day. And also we've seen increase after hours, and actually for nighttime workers, or people transporting at night, where maybe they would have used public transport before because of the social distancing using scooters. The second trend is around journey length. So we've actually seen that increase. So, when we launched our service in York, which was right during the second lockdown in the UK, we expressly worked with the council to try and deliver our service in a way that would augment public transport and some of the main commuter routes that obviously couldn't operate at capacity. So we were seeing journey lengths of 20 to 30 minutes, which is way above the kind of the 10 to 15 minutes that you would typically see. And so we saw people using them in a very different way for those longer trips.
Would you concur, James, along similar lines about that sort of data?
Yeah, I think, what's interesting, obviously, we have the kind of the behavioral changes that happen through the pandemic, right? As there's lockdowns. And I think now we're entering a phase where we're seeing lots of cities opening up across Europe. And I think some of the segments that previously were in pretty much hibernation for the last 18 months are starting to come back now, right? So I think we're starting to see on Free now, the B2B segment is starting to come back as offices are starting to open. We're seeing that obviously the social and partying segment is starting to come back as well, which is obviously mainly based around the weekends. And actually, when it comes to the new mobility options that we actually offer on the platform. So when it comes to the scooters and when it comes to the e-mopeds, we're actually seeing big spikes also at the weekends, which I think is also indicative that, people are trying to get out into the cities now that they're opening up, and obviously are meeting friends and going to the shops and going to restaurants and going to bars. So it's going to be interesting to see how that keeps progressing over the next couple of weeks as the restrictions start to ease even more. And obviously as offices start to open up, business travel is coming back, but also tourism is starting to come back. So we're seeing more trips now from airports into cities, which was, pretty much completely gone over the last 18 months. So this is going to be interesting now to see how that goes over the summer.
I see. Now, perhaps we could sort of talk about the how mobility providers and public transportation should work together. Christian, you talked earlier about how you don't want to replace trains, but trains could be used in conjunction with something like air taxis. How do you see? I'll put this to you, Christian, and then let's hear from the others about how this new wave of startups, of mobility startups, fits in with public infrastructure right now. Christian, you first.
Sure. I think when talking about air travel, it's a highly regulated market. We all know that, right? So before we come to a city and we have agreements or partnerships with Paris, we have with Singapore and also other cities in Japan, we always go to the Civil Aviation Authority, Ministry of Transport, the airports, and also the city itself, right? And what we also offer there is a close integration to that services. And you know what, those, like call it airports or public transport authorities, they are also the biggest real estate owners, right? So what we also have to look at is takeoff and landing sites in the cities. And those public transport owners are also very good players to talk about, and we are in active talks with them to maybe build up a takeoff and landing area on top of their roof. So if someone arrives with a train, he can then fly to another destination. So we directly want to integrate in that service, and obviously not everybody then is using it, but for us it's already good if a couple of thousands are using it. That's already a good chunk for us to start with, right? So I think I see that discussion. And on the airport side, most airports are owned by the city or also the public transportation there. So also there, this is a good inroad for us to talk about takeoff and landing. And the best integration is for us, obviously, not to lose time for a passenger to commute long at the airport to directly airside, then check in and fly into the city.
I see. And perhaps I could put that to you, James, as well. How do you see your services fitting in with public transportation infrastructure?
Yeah, I think they're very complementary, and I think obviously public transport is a very integral part of a urban mobility landscape. We're in the process at the moment of actually having many conversations with different transportation providers across Europe to start the process of doing those integrations. We've run some tests in the last couple of months just with kind of directions and map info and that kind of stuff. But we definitely want to move to a place now where we're looking at ticketing and doing ticketing integrations, because I think, it really is about trying to give all of the possible options to customers and to the public when it comes to how they can move from A to B to C within a city. And I think obviously public transport is very integral to that. And I think what you find is that, you don't have to go from where you are to where you want to get to in just one mobility form, right? It could be that the most efficient and effective way to actually do that is on a couple of different mobility forms. And definitely, I think public transport is going to be a part of that ecosystem. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that progresses in the next 6 months.
Fred, you're obviously you're obviously dovetailing some of your putting scooters, for instance, at public transportation nodes, networks, as it were. Do you see any further integration beyond that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's first of all to say that I think everyone, to combat private car use, it's a team effort. And those companies that get that will succeed. So, the Tier 3 Now partnership, there are times when we actively promote our customers to take a Free Now, if they've been drinking, and vice versa. When it doesn't make sense to get a car, Free Now promote taking a Tier scooter. And the same's true for working with public transit and transport authorities. So, in one level, Mike, as you say, it's around location of parking and pickup spots. SLAs to ensure provision of our service in specific locations to fill transport deserts in cities. But what we're seeing now is actually the level of integration and collaboration going much further with real-time data sharing. So in many cities, and London is a great example, the level of real-time data sharing is, I think, unprecedented. And what TfL are able to do is they're able to kind of set new policies or configurations around whether like parking locations or no-go zones, or configure our service to fit in with the wider transport mix. And instantaneously, we're able to absorb that data, configure our systems, and respond in a way that best serves the city. So we're really seeing that level of partnership really go into new and exciting territory as e-scooters and e-bikes grow.
And I noticed that you guys have also introduced having to check your driver's license before you or upload your driver's license before you get onto scooters. Have you seen any pushback from the public against that kind of thing?
Well, I think that was a necessary requirement as part of the trials in the UK. There's lots of good reasons to do that. To ensure that people ride it responsibly, that only those who understand the rules of the road can use it. Obviously, when you're talking about transport, access and equity is really important. And then, there's some tough questions because we don't want people to be excluded from the service because they haven't got a driving license. particularly these days when actually do we all need a driving license? Increasingly, big swathes of the population are choosing not to. So I think kind of going forward, one of the main learnings that's going to come out of the UK trials is just, what role does that ID license check play, and do we need to tweak it for when scooters hopefully are fully legalised? Right,
yeah. Finally, what's some of the, let's have a little round the robin about what you see some of the emerging trends for new startups in mobility. Are you noticing any new kinds of startups in your arena popping up, or is it clones, or is it pretenders to the throne, or do you see more of the same? Christian first.
I think I see what we also now started is cargo, so electric drones bringing cargo and also deliveries. Yeah, I think this is something emerging and coming. Still futuristic, but you see Amazon and all the players, and it's getting to life right now. The regulatory framework is there as we know it right now. So this is one thing. Secondly, the integration, and I look to Fred and James, if we three would team up with a public transportation agency, we would cover the whole city with all the use cases, right? So I think those things, you will see this integration of that. And then I just ask a question, what happens to our behavior in home office if half of the population works at home? So will that change our real estate living? So what is coming up there, and how to book and use really offices that was traditionally not done, maybe only at the startup level. So question mark, what is coming there next?
Very good point, very interesting. Fred, if I could go to you next. You see any kind of interesting things on the horizon, new startups that you're taking notice of?
I mean, I think there is some kind of evolution in the hardware and the mode of transport. Obviously, on the base level, a scooter still has two wheels, but, we've been innovating a lot with our operating model, with battery technology and some of the safety features on there. In terms of new entrants, what we've seen is quite a lot of kind of small copycats coming in at very highly localized players. But also at the same time, particularly with e-scooters, we've seen cities kind of really look back at micro-mobility 1.0, the early dockless bikes. They've looked at what's happened in some cities if this industry is left unchecked and you get kind of irresponsible behavior. The early days of Paris was a great example, and sort of chaos ensued. And so actually what we're seeing is cities getting really sophisticated in what they want from operators. So and actually the emergence of just a few global players such as Tier, who have the tools and the technology to be able to meet and service those cities' very complex requirements. So, in some ways we're seeing a consolidation of kind of the leaders who are able to provide this service at scale and meet sophisticated requirements, and a few small like copycat players come up in hyper-local markets.
Interesting. And James, with Free Now, do you see any hot new startups in your rear view mirror, as it were, or do you think that you've managed to accelerate it from the pack?
Yeah, I think, that was one of the things that we were really focused on through the course of the pandemic, as obviously the markets were slowing down, is to actually really try and accelerate when it comes to the offering in terms of the breadth, so the kind of geographical footprint, so really expanding into different cities across Europe, but also the depth of the offering, right? So making sure that when we think about how to offer for customers to move from place to place, that we really give them a very good selection, obviously partnering with very strong partners like Tier in all of those locations. And I think what we've been able to do is kind of use that time to really get to a point where there's a really compelling product offering and service offering in place, which doesn't actually exist yet, right? So there's no one else who has that kind of offering. So I think obviously we're very excited now with the lockdowns easing to really see the type of traction that we can drive with that, and with that very strong, compelling, very kind of broad but also deep offering.
Right, I see. So, well, it sounds like you've got things pretty well wrapped up there, but unfortunately that's all we have time for in this session on mobility, what's next for mobility at the Europas Awards. I just want to thank Fred Jones, VP and Regional General Manager for Tier Northern Europe, James Brooke, CPO for Free Now, and Christian Bauer from Volocopter. And I just want to make note that the Europas Conference and Awards, it has also been made possible by support from Free Now. But for now, from me, Mike Butcher, from the Europas Awards, thanks very much for joining us.